Hello and thank you for watching. This video will be showing you how to do the pumpkin carriage from Cinderella. I'm going to first show you what our materials are. So this is an 11 by 14 canvas and I've just turned it in a landscape position to begin with. And here you will need a napkin, water, a palette, and 3 brushes. Here is a background brush that's wide and flat, one that's pointed, or 2 actually that are pointed, one that's medium size and one that's smaller. So here's the blue paint that's going to be our background. You can really use any color of blue. And I'm going to use my background brush to go ahead and apply that. And here's just the application of that. So for the background, I always start in one direction. And here I'm going vertically to start. And again, this is with my wide flat brush, the one I call wide flat. Basically, you want any brush that is got a flat shape and can easily smooth out all the little grooves in the paint. Keep in mind that areas where you have more paint built up will dry slower. And we're using acrylic paints. We'll always use acrylic paints. And you can tell here that I'm also using both sides of the brush going up and down. And here I'm just smoothing out all of those grooves. I found that when using acrylics, the more you move that paint around, the friction helps the paint to dry faster. And here you'll start to see me go the opposite direction. And that is going to provide a very flat base for me to start drawing on. And I'm going to wash out my brush real quick and let the water in that brush dry while the paint on the canvas dries. For this next part, you want to make sure that your background brush is completely dry and has no more moisture in it. And you can see here that I'm wiping off the excess paint and water onto my napkin. And there's the black paint. This is going to go at the bottom, so go ahead and choose which part of the canvas is going to be your bottom, and you're just going to apply that on there. Now you want to make sure that your background is as dry as possible. You can test this with your hand just by lightly tapping the canvas and feeling it to make sure that it's as dry as possible. If it's a little bit sticky, this will still work, but you don't want any paint to come off on your hands when you test it. And I'm just applying that black there at the bottom and dry brushing. So basically, I'm using up all the paint in the paintbrush before getting more paint. And I'm using that same wide flat brush, the background brush. I'm just not mixing it with any water or any more blue paint or anything. I'm just putting the black paint straight on the dried blue paint and going back and forth. And now you want to take this black, this is going to be like the shadow of your pumpkin carriage. You want to take this black no higher than less than 1/4 of a way up the canvas. I'm just applying the paint here and then spreading it out. And you can start to see how the edges are getting fuzzy as I'm using up all the paint in the brush. And I'm also changing the directions of the brush strokes just as I did with the background. And you can see I'm also making very good use of my paper towel there. I don't use very much water at all whenever I do acrylic painting. Really only whenever I'm changing between colors that are very different from one another will I actually wash out the paintbrushes. Here I'm going to start the actual drawing with whatever brush you have that has a pointy tip. First I'm going to make little marks of where my pumpkin is, the top and the bottom. So there I've just made a mark for the top. And here I'm going to make a mark for the bottom. This will help me to keep proportions and make sure that I don't get my pumpkin too large. And here I'm going to connect those with a big line. Don't try to do the line all in one sweeping motion. You can see I'm doing like segmented lines to make sure that I get it in proportion. It doesn't have to be perfect, we're just going to fill it in with white later. So any mistakes you make, you can just fix it with blue or white paint. And here I'm just doing the other side to kind of mirror it. At this point, it's going to look, I guess, more like an apple. But keep in mind, it's also a pumpkin. It's an organic shape. It's not something that is meant to look pristine and perfect. Here I'm doing the coach stand, I guess is what it's called, with just a line. As long as you do this line with one side higher than where it connects to the bottom of the pumpkin, then you've done it right. And here I'm just going to give that some form and round it out, bring it back down, and connect it once again. It almost kind of looks like a snake. And this next part is just for some ornamental design feature. We're going to color in this shape with gold. And then you can add swirlies and such to it. Now in the place of a stem, we're doing like a little ornate topper on top of the pumpkin. And how I do that is I just have these shapes that tower on top of each other like the Eiffel Tower or like a pyramid. So there's the first shape and then the second. And then they just get smaller and smaller. Now I'm adding white paint. This white paint is going to go inside of the pumpkin. It's going to cover up that blue. So there I'm testing the blue to make sure that it's completely dry. Now you'll have to do a total of at least 3 layers of this white, because since it's acrylic white, my experience with acrylic white has been that whenever it dries, the pigment tends to be really streaky. So I always have to do several layers of white. But this is our first layer. And you can see that I'm kind of doing an outline first, an inner outline. So I'm letting it touch the black and not completely cover it. So I still have a bit of an outline there, but I'm outlining the inside of my black outline first and then filling in. And I'm using, I guess you would say, my medium-sized brush. As long as the brush is a medium size, it doesn't really matter what shape it is. I'm just partial to a round brush. And you see at this point, I'm not worrying too much about smoothing out all of those streaks. They are what they are. I'm just gonna let it dry. And then all of that will be covered up and won't be noticeable whenever we do our other layers. And you'll see that I'm using a very similar brush stroke technique as I did with the background. I'm going up and down. And now acrylic dries really quickly, but a good thing about that is that while we're waiting on that to dry, we can move on to the next step. So we're going to go ahead and color in our gold accents. I'm washing out my brush there, wiping it off on the paper towel which isn't in view right now. And then going ahead and starting to lay in that gold. Now the gold that I have here is a pretty heavy body acrylic gold. If you have a thinner gold color, like the brand's Folk Art, that's a really popular brand that I like to use. You'll just maybe need to do 2 or 3 layers of that, the same way you would do the white. But what I'm using is LiQWYD, I believe, which is a heavier body. And whenever I say heavier body, that just means that it's a thicker paint, so you usually don't have to do as many layers to get a really consistent color. And you'll see that I just completely covered up that middle line there because it was really kind of distracting, and didn't really have any qualms about just covering that up. And I'm going to do the same thing there, all the little segmented pieces in the topper. I'm just going to kind of cover up. Now in person, you can still see the segment parts, the lines in between the shapes a little bit, but that just gives it kind of a sculpted look. And you're seeing I'm just using that gold to kind of fill out that shape a little bit more and give it a little bit more form. Once you start getting to the part where you color things in, you can start to change the shape a little bit if you want to. And I'm testing that white to make sure it's dry before I start my second layer of that white. The reason I'm doing that, and the reason I want to make sure that that first layer of white is completely dry, is because sometimes whenever you are doing layers of acrylic, whenever you put wet paint on paint that is still in the drying process and is not completely dry, your brush and the motion of your brush can pull up those previous layers, and it's really hard to fix. All you can really do at that point is let it dry for a really long time, but you end up getting these little clumpy bits from where the layers pulled up. I've also switched to a broader brush here too to try and flatten out some of the brush strokes. If you have that brush available, that might help you get a more consistent color with this white. But it's not necessary, because honestly the strokes just make it more a more realistic pumpkin texture anyway. I just wanted my color to be really smooth. And see right there, I had to go back and cover up from where my brush had kind of pulled up a little bit of the previous layer. And I think that actually happened not because the paint wasn't dry, but actually because I might have had a little bit of water left in my brush from washing it. So again, that's just something to be aware of whenever you're using water-soluble paints, which most acrylics are, or pretty much all acrylics should be water-based, but especially temperas are made to wash out with water, so they tend to be a little bit more unstable whenever mixed with water. And I'm really being a perfectionist about this, trying to get a really flat color. But keep in mind too that we're also going to add a lot of little details and decorations to this pumpkin carriage that, you know, you're not going to end up seeing a lot of these little blotchy areas. So get your disposable cup, and this is how we're going to do the wheels. You're going to take black paint and put it on the rim of the cup. And again, this is going to be my cup for doing this process with. Test it out, kind of see where you want it. And then this is our first wheel. We're just kind of stamping it on there, and I'm rolling around the edges a little bit and keeping it on there to make sure that I get a full circle. So there's the first wheel. And then I'm going to do my second. And remember that this paint dries really, really fast. So you may think that you put enough on the cup for both wheels, but you actually need 2 rounds of that paint on the rim. There's the second wheel. Now before I touch that again, I'm going to let it dry completely. So I'm going to fill in and do my third layer of the white while that dries. I'm also taking the opportunity here to do a spot check and just go through and put the white in spaces where I can see the background color showing through. So not necessarily doing a full, you know, 4th layer, but just going through and fixing little mistakes and imperfections. At this time, you can also use your brush with the white paint to fix imperfections in your initial sketched outline. So if there is a spot that is a little uneven, or where you drew it and it's a little bumpy, you can now smooth it out with your fill-in color. And you'll see I'm almost kind of just depositing that color into the places where I want it. I'm letting this layer be a little bit thicker than my initial layers because it's going to be the final one, and I'm just making sure to smooth it out really well with my flat brush. This would be a little bit more difficult to achieve with the first brush that I used for this layer, where I was just aiming to fill in the space accurately. For this, I'm wanting a wider flat brush to evenly spread the paint. So for evenness, you want this flatter brush, and for precision, you want a rounder brush, or a round brush, or a pointed brush. All the while that I'm doing this, I'm actually also waiting for the wheels to dry, because I can't move on to the wheels, which I'm going to outline with white, until every bit of that black paint is dry, or else my wheels are just going to be gray. But the next part we're actually going to do is use our smallest pointed brush to start on our door, beginning with the very bottom line. So we're going to mark the bottom first with just a flat horizontal line. And again, this is with your pointed brush with black paint. And now we're going to do 2 vertical lines, which will be the sides of our door. And now the arch is last. And it doesn't have to be perfect because you can fix it with gold whenever the black is dry. And there I just traced the inside of it and just kind of mirrored the inside shape so that it looks like it has a rim around the door. And here I'm going to start on the grooves. So I start with 1 line in the middle, the grooves of the pumpkin, and then 2 lines on each side. And they're more like little hash marks. I'm not letting these lines be really thick and sharp. I'm letting them fade out towards the ends. So they have like a little tail. They start bold and then they fade out. And I'm mirroring that same pattern on the bottom, coming up from the bottom. And that's going to form the beginning of the grooves of your pumpkin. And there I'm just giving the impression of the grooves going all the way down the pumpkin. I don't want to make them so literal and so pronounced that they will distract from the details I'm going to do later on. So I'm just doing little tiny thin lines going down. So for every line there will be another one about midway. And here I'm starting on the white. And I'm using that smallest pointed brush after washing it and letting it dry, of course, it just didn't show it in this, to trace the inside of the wheel first. So we're going to have the black outline, but then also the white will be on the opposite side of that line. And we're just going to keep making it thicker until we have a ring. And you can see I'm a bit more practiced, so I can make some of these lines in long sweeping strokes, but if that is difficult for you, then you can absolutely just do little segmented strokes to form this shape. And if your circle was a little bit imperfect, then you can also use the white to fix that. But remember to not start this step until that initial black imprint from the cup is completely dry. And this part is probably the most tedious of this entire painting, but keep in mind that in the long run, little details like little bumpy areas and stuff like that will not end up being very noticeable, because we're also going to put more ornament into this and more details, and also the spokes of the wheels will help to distract from any imperfections in the actual wheel. To begin the center of your wheel, you're just going to make kind of like a dot in what about looks the center to you, and then just keep making that dot bigger until it becomes a circle. And you can make the circle however big you want it to be, but keep in mind that it's like a wheel plate. So later we're going to put gold on top of it and make it look really ornamented. And I'm just following the same process with the next wheel. just going around. And keep in mind that if you mess up a little bit with the white, it's probably better just to let that white dry because it will cover up very easily with blue or black. With the blue or the black of your background, you can fix any imperfections with white pretty easily. This part here is a little bit like if you were to ever do winged eyeliner. Whenever you try to do winged eyeliner, it's a whole thing about whenever you're trying to do that and you keep trying to make it as perfect as possible and you keep trying so hard to fix all the little imperfections as you go that you end up with a whole eyelid full of black eyeliner. And it's not at all what you wanted. So the moral of the story is to try not to get too caught up in the little imperfections to the point where you get something that is not even close to what you were aiming for in the first place. And I'm especially bad about that. But again, most of those imperfections you really won't notice in the long run anyway. And you'll notice that I'm doing this white inner line on the inside of the black outline, so that that black outline is still a little bit visible, so that we don't have white sitting on top of white on top of the white pumpkin. We still want to be able to tell the wheel apart from the pumpkin. And there I've made my other wheel cap, and I'm just going to make my other one bigger to match it. I decided to make them a little bit bigger so that whenever I put the gold on it, I have more room to add bolts. And here in these finer details, I'm literally using the very, very tip of that paintbrush to just draw with. I'm not using the entire width of the pointed paintbrush for most of this. And I'm also going through areas where the black wasn't completely dry and it mixed with the white and just made it gray. And I'm just covering that back up with white. So about 2 rounds or 2 coats over these lines here. And you can see I'm just kind of evening out those lines. And the plates of the wheels there, the centers, they don't have to be perfectly white, but I am going to go ahead and do 2 layers of those. We're just going to put gold right on top of it though. So if they're a little streaky, then it's really okay. You're not going to notice through the gold. And here I'm going to start the spokes of the wheels, and the way I'm going to draw those is literally just like how you would cut a pizza. So going in half and then quartering and then just dividing each section by half. In the original I had 16 spokes, but you can do less than or more than that if you want. Since your wheels might be a different size than mine, depending on what size cup you used, you might end up with fewer or more spokes. Which is absolutely fine, just do whatever you think looks good. And here we go in half. And then make our quarters. And then just continue to divide each section in half. And you'll notice how whenever I add the spokes, you really don't notice any unevenness in the wheel shape unless you're really looking hard at it. Making good use of that napkin there. And here I'm taking some black and touching up the bottom of the wheel. So it's totally okay to go back and forth with your background colors to fix any little mistakes or imperfections. And here I've got my gold. I'm going to start coloring in, and I'm just laying that gold right on top of my black outline. Again, I'm going to let it completely cover that arch that I did on the inside. That's just going to make it look like, again, like it's got a welded pattern on it without actually having to do any shading. See, that arch is still visible from underneath that gold paint. And then I'm going to fill in the plates, the center of the wheels here with gold so that they look like they've been ornamented. I'm just filling in that circle with gold, just allowing a little bit of white to shine, to show through on the edges. Touching up my other areas with the gold. Now this gold paint that I'm using is really reflective, so really one coat is enough, but I'm also using it to create other shapes. Again, this is a heavier body gold that I'm using, like a brand like LiQWYD versus Folk Art. I'm doing the same to my little topper. And now I'm going to go in and start doing the little details and decorations. So here at the bottom, I'm actually filling in the in-between spaces of the grooves of the pumpkin that I did earlier, the same way that you would make like elementary school spider webs. So almost just like an arch in between each line and then filling it in with gold. And you can see this gold is very, very reflective. Just swoop and then filling it in. And now I'm going to go here at the top and just start doing little swirly designs. You can do them how I'm doing them in here, or you can just make up your own design. I'm almost just kind of making little grooves and tick marks. I'm not focusing too much on trying to make each little swirly thing perfect and look like it's really detailed, because what I'm going for is mostly the overall look of something having been decorated. Whenever you look really close at it, it won't look very impressive, but all of these little details together will make it read really well from afar. Bringing that gold a little bit farther down. And I'm just doing kind of like swooping patterns. And here I'm adding dots that could be like little bolts, or they could just be little jewels that are along the lines of the grooves of the pumpkin. And I'm not worrying about these dots being completely perfect. I'm not worrying about them being perfectly measured out and being evenly spaced from one another. They're just there to contribute to the overall look and the overall aesthetic of this being a decorated carriage. And I'm going to make those little dots all along each line that's a groove in the pumpkin. All the while I'm letting the gold on my door dry. I'm going to add swirls to it too, but they're going to be in a different color, so I want to let the gold dry first. And something that you don't quite see because of the position of the camera is during a lot of these little details, the side of my hand is not touching the canvas at all. I'm actually pointing my pinky out the same way that you would if you were at a fancy tea party, and placing it on the canvas for balance, so that I keep my brush a certain distance away from the canvas without putting my entire hand on it. This way I have a little more control over where my hand touches the canvas, so that I make sure not to stick it in any white paint or any wet paint. But it also helps me to have a really, really steady hand. And I'm adding another coat of that gold. And here is when you'll start to notice that I'm putting a little more detail and effort into fixing any uneven areas and making that door a bit more symmetric. And now here is where you'll start to see some really little details that you guys don't have to worry very much about. You know, don't feel stressed about making them perfect. See, here I'm doing a little bit of filigree and ornate things. Here I'm doing hinges, which the hinges are literally just tiny rectangles that are also gold on either side of the door. And I've got black here that I'm using to add definition to these details. And at this point, I'm not really even using any water at all. I'm going back and forth between the gold and the black, creating this sort of medium color. And then if I want to get rid of one, then I wipe it on the paper towel, but I don't want to mix it in water right now and risk peeling up the layers that are still semi-wet. See, there I am with the paper towel. You'll notice I use the paper towel a lot more than I use water. This is the same reason that all of my clothes are covered in paint. Now I'm working towards having clothes designated just as painting clothes that I can freely wipe the excess paint off with. Doing a second layer of gold in the wheels. This is a good example of composition. So I've used my accent color, which is gold, in almost a pyramid-like fashion. I have the little bit up at top, and then the way the forms go, they form a pyramid-like shape. It's an abstract pyramid shape, but I've got the top, middle, and bottom, with the top being the smallest and the bottom being the biggest. But these are forms that are traditionally pleasing to the eye, so that's where I've chosen to add my biggest chunks of the accent color, which are gold. And then I've also chosen to have my coach stand, which makes it asymmetrical, which I like asymmetry, not everyone does. But a lot of times having asymmetry in a painting can give the effect of motion. And since this is a painting of an object that does move, I wanted to make it asymmetric. There I'm just trimming the bottom there where it was a little bit uneven with white. And you can really start to see the picture come together as I finish up these little details. Now I'm going in with that little brush and just making little swirlies with a darkened tone of my gold. So this is a gold that maybe is mixed with just a tiny bit of the black I've been using to create really detailed little grooves. And here I'm making bolts. The way I'm making these bolts is literally just tapping the brush and making little blobs with the black where I want a bolt to be. And then whenever those are dry, I'm going to go right on top of them with gold. So first little black dots, let the black dots dry, and then do gold on top of them. And now that this gold is drying, I'm adding little swirls and fancy details to the coach stand. And this is, of course, a very abstract interpretation. These things in real life would have a lot more detail, but these paintings that we do for Tipsy Tea Party are designed to be able to do between an hour and a half and 2 hours. I'm sharpening up those details around the door. That's black that I have with my thinnest, pointiest brush. Again, sharpening up those details. I'm taking that white back because you can see as that white on the wheels dried, it has slowly gotten more and more gray. The color has gotten more and more diluted in comparison, especially to the pumpkin where we have at least 3 or 4 layers. So I'm going to do at least 1 more layer on my wheels just to make that white really stand out. But that's a good example, and it's a good visual of how important it is to do multiple layers with acrylics. And some of my more advanced and involved acrylics that I do just in my spare time that I sell, I'll have anywhere from 8 to 12 layers of acrylic painting in just a single area. Especially if I'm trying to do something like a realistic skin tone or something like that, where you have multiple colors in a small area. And while I'm doing this, those black blobs that are in the wheels that are going to become our bolts are drying. Now, as you're doing your painting, you may find that certain things that I'm doing here in the example and in the instruction, you may not need to do or want to do, and that's absolutely fine. You guys are welcome to take whatever creative liberties you want to with your own painting. Now the next thing we have left to do is to add the silver around our corners and edges. This just kind of helps to draw in attention to our pumpkin carriage, as well as to fill in any extra negative space around the edges. And I'm using a similar heavy body acrylic for this silver, so it's very reflective and it's very thick, so you should only need one layer of it. One to maybe 2 layers. And we're going to do a similar brush technique to what we did with the black at the bottom. So I'm using my wider brush to apply that silver first in the corners, and then I'm just spreading that out, and I'm going to continue to spread it out, letting it fill all of the empty spaces, going back and forth. And you may even say I'm going very quickly with the brush too, adding a lot of friction. And that one bit of paint covered so much space. And I'm drying it off there. And adding it to my other corner, which is just a bit out of view, but you can still see most of what's going on. But I have more negative space in this corner because the design does not have the stagecoach on that side. So I'm going to use this silver to fill in a bit more of that negative space on that side. You can see my brush is going kind of fast. This video isn't sped up at all. My brush strokes are going back and forth very quickly. And here I'm almost kind of doing like a circular motion. If you look over here in the right hand corner, you can see where I'm starting to fade that silver onto the blue. My palette is up there at the top out of view, but it's the silver that I'm using. And I'm almost just kind of doing little circular motions with that brush. Again, this is a wider flat brush that I'm adding this color on with. And see here, I've completely run out of color in my brush, and I'm just using my brush to spread the color that is on the canvas around before I fill my brush back up with paint, because I want it to have that faded effect around the pumpkin. And see, I had a little bit too much paint in my brush, so I put a bunch of it up there in the corner where there was already silver. And now I'm just spreading it out. I just used that excess paint to make another layer of the silver in the corner. Don't be afraid to use your fingers. You'll see me use my fingers sometimes. Here, I'm going to smooth that out. And now in this video, I've kept this painting horizontal in this landscape position for most of the time. But while you guys are painting, feel free to adjust the position of your canvas however you need to make it work for you. Now this technique with the brush can be a little rough on your brushes, so you might want to get a cheaper set that you can kind of use and abuse. And then keep your nicer ones for reusable use. Now the next color and brush that we're going to use, I'm going to explain a little bit ahead of time because some of the video got cut out. But we're going to make the sparkles by doing swirly lines and then making dripping type sparkles that come off of them. Which you will see in the end. But the actual painting of those got kind of cut out. But here you can see those, and we're going to look at a couple angles. The painting is now finished. So I just want to thank everyone so much for giving this a watch, and please like and subscribe.